Good morning. Oh, you can hear me. That's right. Let us settle down, please. And also, I'm Professor Kapoor, and my first name is Sudarshan, but people out of love and affection call me Su, and that is S-U, there is no E over there. So please keep that in mind, Dr. Su Kapoor or Su Kapoor, whatever. We have a very distinguished panel. I was reading their bio, very much impressed, and I'm pretty sure they are going to impress you also. Let me also welcome all of you for this morning session, which is basically the focus is on immigration, asylum, and human rights, like that. It's a very burning topic actually these days. Every day you hear something or the other issue or a news related to either asylum seekers, immigrants, refugees being mistreated, mishandled, and to the extent of oppression, actually, to be very honest. This is the way I feel it, like that. I don't want to take too much time. I want to give the maximum time to our speakers. You are here to listen to them, not to me. But I certainly would like to take a few minutes to introduce who are the people on the panel are, like that. They're very impressive. I had met them on the email, but personally I met them this morning. It was a great pleasure to meet all the three of you, particularly knowing who they are, what they are doing. It's a very impressive, very impressive. I have also been teaching courses like peace building and conflict resolution and human rights and immigration. I'm retired, by the way. But they asked me to, I taught about 40 years as a full professor at Fresno State. Then they asked me to come back to teach a program that I started long time ago. So I teach in one class. Teaching probably is something, a therapy for me. So it works for my own mental health, like that, very good, like that, over there. I'm very much concerned and interested actually in the topic that we are going to be talking. And I just heard that my panelists have requested that they would like to have a dialogue, a kind of a conversation among themselves, which I like very much. That will be very, very good. But let me just say a little bit about them, who they are. First on my list is Diana, and her last name is Essex. I'm not sure if I'm going to do any violence to your last name. How you pronounce your last name? Essex-Lettieri. Okay. Yeah, I'm a very non-violent person. Don't want to cause any violence to the names like that over there. But I'm going to call out of love Diana. Okay, that will be a lot easier. And next to her is Tenzin, like that. That is her first name, and Seldon is the last name, like that over there. And for my left is Jack. Jack, I'm trying to see your full name also. Yes, here it is. Because Jack was the one who actually did not send me his bio, I'm going to let him address himself. Let us call him Jack, like that over there. That's right. Now, Diana, all of these have a very impressive kind of I'm going to shorten it a little bit, just my privilege like that, but I don't want to really, I still would like to see that you have some good picture like that. Diana leads the Asylum Access. That's the name of the project organization that she leads at. And she's all over the world, looks like that. That project has impact in Malaysia, Thailand, and Mexico. Wow, from one end to the other end, like that over there. She congregates the organization's global leadership team. That's a lot of responsibility, like that. Diana also serves as one of the Asylum Access ambassador. You sound like a peace ambassador, actually, like that over there, that you are. Helping to promote the importance of human rights as the core to refugee response. Refugees have human rights also. Not many people realize or understand that they have human rights. They have rights like that, and she is going to deal with that over there. She is a visiting scholar at Stanford University Center also, she has been. And also, she is connected with the international security and cooperation. She holds her master's in law and diplomacy. That's a very important field, like that, over law and diplomacy, like that, over there. From the Fletcher School of International Studies, which I know very well. I have visited that school, by the way, like a long time ago. Yeah. And she holds also Bachelor of Arts degree in International Development from University of California in Los Angeles. She has a marvelous background, and she is expert in her field. Let us welcome her also. Okay. I'm going to do the welcoming all right now. Then we have Tenzin. Tenzin has a very powerful, interesting background. She just told me her relationship with the Dalai Lama and her being in Himachal Pradesh, a state actually in India, in Dharamshala. When I was growing up as a child, actually my ambition was to join the high school over there in Dharamshala, but my parents did not allow me to go too far from the neighborhood. You know how it is, parents sometimes have. I have a great fondness of that place. It's a very, very beautiful place, by the way, over there. Tenzin is the founder of KinStep. She is going to explain that what it is. It's a social enterprise platform that connects immigrants to safety and for steady jobs. Very important work like that over there. She also serves on many boards and commissions and committees. There's a great list actually that I have here. Tenzin graduated at the top of her class at Stanford University. Thank you. Great for that. She's a great scholar like that over there. And she also is a Rhodes Scholar, and also with the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar like that. She's an advocate for the disenfranchised communities, and particularly leading to climate justice league chapters in United States and working on negotiation with Israel and Palestine. Wow. It is wonderful to have people like her on our panel. Tenzin works has been recognized all around the world like that. Oh, there are so many organizations and institutions that have given her the recognition like that over there. And she is one of the 5 civil rights leaders for new generation. She is considered that way. That's a very important recognition that she has received like that. Another big qualification is she is an innovative disruptor. And that's a nonviolent tactic, by the way. We were just talking actually in Mubarak Abbas. Mubarak Abbas was giving us a list of 350 methods and techniques, because he has improved upon what Gene Sharp's work was. I know Gene Sharp's work. He had improved. So we were talking about disruption as a nonviolent technique like that. And she's an innovative disruptor like that. So let us welcome her also like that. Jack, I am going to give you the freedom and liberty. Take as much time you want to introduce yourself like that.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jack Herrera. I'm a journalist. I report. I think actually my hesitation in sending my bio might have come from a subconscious realization that the people on the panel with are so impressive. a bit nervous to see my accomplishments next to theirs. But I report on immigration from a human rights perspective. And I think that what that means today is quite simple, which is that I report on the experience of immigrants themselves instead of what is happening in Washington or what is being said or done in terms of policy for them. I'm writing about their own experiences, whether it's crossing deserts and highlands in Guatemala and Mexico, whether it's the experience of trans women in ICE detention centers in New Mexico and Texas, and the experience of people who are waiting for long periods of time in places like Tijuana and Juarez, waiting to cross over to the United States. My primary interest from a human rights perspective is forced migration out of Central America at this moment for various reasons. I think that, as I'm sure we can understand, it's an oversimplistic vision which is given often in the media, which frames people fleeing exclusively violence or exclusively for economic reasons. There are so many reasons why people leave their country. And I think part of having a realistic and humane immigration policy, no matter what your perspective is on encouraging or limiting immigration, requires us to look clear-eyed and realistically at why people leave. And then that's not possible in a perspective where we oversimplify or demonize people for migrating. And so that's the sort of perspective I'm trying to correct, which is the centuries of demonization of migration in this country, and then also a deep misunderstanding in the media that flattens and stereotypes the experience of immigrants.
Thank you very much, Jack. Let's welcome you also. And I have a very important role, and that is I'm going to sit quietly over there and let the speakers have the dialogue. Only my request is that please do keep a little time for the audience to ask questions. And we are here until 12. At least would like to see at least 20 minutes to 25 minutes after you have a dialogue among yourself, because you know what you're going to talk about. You already have discussed the framework. That is very nice. So that makes my work very easier, a little bit like that. So I'm going to just sit and quietly listen to all the three of you, but we would like to have the audience to ask some questions actually. And in case you think that you do have an important question or clarification, I'm pretty sure you won't mind, raise a hand so then they could answer. Like sometimes it happens. I allow my students, when I give a 3-hour lecture actually in my classes, I do allow them, hey, if there is something that you don't understand, please raise hand, then I will stop. So I think actually it would be nice to have that privilege to be exercised, so that if something is not very clear, you have immediate desire, burning desire to ask a question, just raise a hand, and I'm pretty sure they will acknowledge that. Thank you very much. Let's give them a warm welcome, all the three of them. All right, I will let you start that.
Thank you so much, Professor Kapoor. Thank you so much, Dr. Carson, Truman. This is really a wonderful opportunity for us to celebrate Gandhi and the union of inspiration behind Gandhi, for leaders such as Dr. King, and for my spiritual leader, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So it's interesting because I grew up in India. I was raised in India. My family are originally from Tibet. They fled through the Himalayas, dodging soldiers' bullets to make it to India. And they were the lucky ones who survived the battlegrounds, and the lucky ones who were able to reintegrate in India. And Dr. Kapoor's home is actually not too far from mine. He's in Punjab, our neighbor. And so the experience of being in the Himalayas at the time, our spiritual leader, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, really anchored his belief in Gandhi and Gandhi's teachings of nonviolence. So my entire life, I grew up actually prostrating to Gandhi and to really understand and live his values. And it really wasn't until when I came to Stanford. I transferred here from a community college in Oakland and Berkeley, and I came to Stanford, and one of the first classes I took was Dr. Carson's. And it was a civil disobedience nonviolent classes I took, which looked at Gandhi and the perspective of Gandhi through a very, very detail-oriented and yet at the same time dynamic perspective that I never held. I was someone who had this deep personal connection with Gandhi in the spirit of nonviolence because of the Tibetan movement being one of the longest standing nonviolent movements. But I never ever examined Gandhi for his practice and for what he did for India. So I'm very honored to be back here. It's a real full circle moment for me. The issue of civil rights for refugees and migrants is something that deeply concerns me. I think that now this is an issue that cannot be ignored by anybody in this world. There's believed to be from anywhere from 200 million to 1 billion climate refugees in the next 30 years. So we're talking about 1 billion people. You can't ignore 1 billion people. You could ignore 1 million people, or 5 million people, or even 15 million people, but you cannot ignore 1 in every 9 human beings. So climate refugees is just one subset of the refugees that will be on this planet in the next 30 years. And my story is a story that millions of people, 1 billion potentially, will have. And my story is really that of asking the people in the nation, what does it mean to integrate refugees with dignity? We have lost complete sense of what it means to integrate with dignity. It shouldn't be a question that refugees and migrants have human rights and dignity. And when I transitioned to America, my mother won the immigration lottery when I was 3 years old. So I was disunited with her. I reunited with her about 10 years later. And I was reunited with her and reintegrated in Minnesota, of all places in America. You know, you can imagine a refugee girl from the Himalayas in Minnesota is not going to be the most ideal site. So it was many years of learning the language, the culture. But one of the things I always felt was missing in the process of our integration was dignity. I felt that there were a lot of people who were giving me sympathy. There were a lot of social workers who were giving us services. But there was not really a pipeline to be able to integrate ourselves in this country with greater dignity. And I knew that once I became a citizen, and once I had the language and the lexicon to be able to speak to people, once I had the pedagogy of places and pedigrees of places like Stanford and Oxford, I would work on and dedicate my life to working on migration issues and making sure that migrants and refugees like me and my family had dignity in the process. I think we can get down, and this could be a conversation of how exactly we give dignity and what is the process of giving dignity, but that's really, for me, the most important thing and the most emblematic thing that was missing.
Thank you so much, Tenzin. Such a wonderful way to start this, and thank you, Dr. Kapoor, for creating a welcoming and yet somehow tenacious environment to talk about human rights. I wanted to start by giving some background on what asylum access does and some context for what asylum access does. And so in the world today, there are about 26 million refugees. Refugees strictly defined as those who have crossed a border due to persecution that fits into some very specific groups. So there's a problem with the definition, and I think your opening comments really help and your opening comments too, about how when we put people in boxes, it excludes a lot of people from protection. And I want to acknowledge that and also set it on the side so that I can talk a little bit about the experiences of refugees. So of the 26 million in the world right now, less than 1% annually will access the kind of program that brings them to the United States or to the UK or to Australia through what's known as resettlement. And that, of course, access to even resettlement is tightening dramatically right now. You may have caught in the news in the past month that the Donald Trump administration has now cut positions in the United States down to 18,000 annually. When President Obama left office, we were welcoming 100,000 annually. And actually, in practice, it'll be much less than the 18,000. That's a cap. In practice, it'll be far fewer. So what is the reality for people most will stay in countries that neighbor their own and will have arrived by foot or will have arrived by boat. And most will live in the global south. And many find themselves in environments where they don't have protection against arbitrary detention, arrest, and deportation. So having committed no crime, aside from your immigration status, which if you are fleeing violence and persecution should not be a crime, are being imprisoned and subject to deportation, perhaps back to a life-threatening situation. Even if you're able to access legal status, accessing the right to work is very difficult. And all of us, it's a common human experience. Everyone wants the opportunity to be self-sufficient, right? That's where we derive purpose and meaning. And so this is a major barrier that refugees around the world face. And here's the part that is so hardest to wrap your head around, that the average time spent in exile has now topped 20 years. And if you're a refugee for longer than 5 years, that number is more like 30 years. So the reality is that people are not going home. It is not a temporary situation to be a refugee in most parts of the world. The response system that the international community has set up to respond to refugee situations is rooted in one of two things for the most part: humanitarian aid, or the provision of food, water, and medical care, shelter, which is critically important in emergency situations. It saves lives. We have to have humanitarian aid. But you can imagine after 20 years, is humanitarian aid, is that the thing you want to be your lifeline? No, nobody would prefer that. And then the other way that we respond as an international community to refugee situations is through development aid. Education initiatives, and there's a trend toward innovative market stimulation and market access for refugees, which is also really important. And some of the newer programs are really exciting. Some of the work the World Bank is doing is really exciting. But if you don't have a work permit and legal status, you will never get off of humanitarian aid, and you will never be able to make safe use of the outcomes of development programs. And so what I'm talking about is missing, generally from refugee response, is the conversation about human rights. And that rights are the thing that all of us need in order to live full, happy, and complete lives as a starting point. And then you have to worry about integration and all the pieces that prevent us from being able to meaningfully exercise our rights. So asylum access is focused on this piece of the puzzle as a hugely important and missing ingredient generally in refugee response. And not just human rights in the international norms sense of the word, because in practice, we all have undeniable human rights, or in reality, we all have undeniable human rights. In practice, refugees' human rights are violated constantly. And so what makes them a reality is when they are enshrined in national laws, policies, and practices, and that there is somebody to hold a state accountable to those laws, policies, and practices. And so we focus as an organization on ensuring that those international norms get integrated into national settings. And Asylum Access works in Mexico, Thailand, and Malaysia, and we have projects in Jordan and Lebanon. And our focus is to empower and equip local advocates with the tools they need to engage their governments directly, to put laws and policies in place if they're not in place, or strengthen laws and policies when they are inadequately implemented. And then we also equip national lawyers, so those who are barred in the countries that we work in, and they connect with individual refugee families in their pursuit of individualized solutions. So one of the things we like to do when we talk about migration as refugees is talk about groups of people, because in response is about groups of people. How do we manage this 100,000? How do we manage that 100,000? What do we do about the 4 million people that have left Venezuela? And while it may, on some level, you have to think about it that way so we can conceptualize how big response needs to be, at the core, we've got individual families who need individual solutions. And if you do not have a lawyer by your side, it is very, very hard to get that individualized solution. And it's very strange how few around the world have access to legal support. It is mind-blowing. The numbers are so minuscule. And so Asylum Access has national legal teams around the world that are working with individuals to find solutions on an individual basis.
I think just that last point about the role of counsel in searching for asylum is so important, especially from my perspective in this country right now. There have been multiple studies out of Syracuse University that show that asylum seekers seeking refugee status in the United States, their chances of gaining refugee status increase by over 5% if they have access to counsel. Of course, in the US immigration system, because it's actually not part of our judicial system, the United States provides no access to counsel for people in the immigration system, and that includes the refugee system. And so everyone, unless they're able to afford a lawyer, connect with pro bono services, is representing themselves, and that includes children who are on the stand representing themselves, children as young as 4 years old. If you can talk, you can represent yourself in court to try and gain refugee status. And I think it should really concern us that that's the statistic, that if you're represented, if you are able to work within this legal system and have someone who understands what is an actually incredibly obscure and Byzantine asylum system, your chances of gaining asylum goes up. And so that means that there are people with very good cases, very good, quote unquote, good reasons for leaving their country that will not gain asylum in this country. In both of your opening remarks here, I am reminded of something that I have to think about each time I begin an article. When a journalist begins writing for an audience, you have to fit in early on what the background information is here. What do you need to understand this story? And often that's what's the latest policy, what's the history here, and what's the context you need to understand before we get into this particular. And whenever I write about immigration or refugee issues, the context and history that is too immense to ever fit in a lead paragraph, but is so necessary, is the fact that in this country and around the world, there have been hundreds of years of dedicated and focused efforts to demonize immigrants and migration. I have a Mexican family, and I grew up in a Mexican community. And of course, immigration is part of many, not all, but many people's stories in the Latinx community in this country. And I remember in high school, we began forming a group, like a Latinx student union at my high school. And one of the phrases that we put on the wall that was really meaningful to a lot of us was, "Migration is beautiful." And I think that when I first saw that written up, I had the realization that even as someone who grew up with both a tolerant and embrace of immigrants in my family and other people's families, I still had this notion that migration had to be done for a legitimate reason, that it was bad if you changed countries unless you had a very good reason for coming, unless you were going to be a contribution to this next nation, or if you were fleeing for good refugee issues. And I think that we have to recognize that instinct in some of us is the product of hundreds of years of a dedicated and focused demonization of the reasons people leave. And that looks different in a global perspective. In the United States, probably the beginning of a very focused race-based white supremacist immigration policy began with the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 1800s. And what is the origin? What is the need for that sort of policy? It comes from skyrocketing inequality. And those responsible for that problem in the upward distribution of wealth needed to find, such as the founder of this university, needed to find a scapegoat, needed to find a reason to distract from a movement of solidarity against inequality. And that scapegoat came very easily in Chinese immigrants, that you could tell people who are working in California, what is the reason why you work so hard and have so little? It's not the robber barons sitting in their mansions, it's the Chinese immigrants. And so I think that that's important when we're looking at these issues in specific context to understand what is the origin of the demonization of migrants and what is its history and how do you fight it. And so that's something I think about when I'm writing my articles, whether it be about immigrants in this country or elsewhere. I think that's what makes the issue with asylum and refugee access today so troubling, is that you see what has historically been seen as the most legitimate reason for migrating. If you're actually fleeing bullets, if you're fleeing death in the country behind you, that has been seen as an okay reason to leave. And today that window is getting smaller and smaller, like who actually counts as a refugee, who actually deserves to leave, is getting to be, people are met with such a doubt and such suspicion and scrutiny on borders. And I think what's really scary is, Dan, as you said, that there's a very small subset of people who, under the current refugee conventions and refugee laws, both internationally and in this country, it's a very small set of people who actually qualify for refugee status. And I think the easiest way to say that is, we have an idea, I think many of us have an idea, that if you're fleeing for your life, you're a refugee. And that is just not the case under the law. You have to be fleeing a very specific kind of persecution. And the 1951 convention names explicitly nationality, religion, and race, as well as some other special groups, but there's so much missing in that definition. Gender is a big one. That in this country, there wasn't a gender-based persecution claim until the 1990s, when it was shown that women could be a persecuted group and could qualify for refugee status because of persecution because of the status of their gender. But what's really troubling when we look on to the next century is that climate refugees have absolutely no protections under the law. If you're fleeing intense drought, if you're fleeing natural disaster, if you cannot live, if you will die in the country you're living in because of conditions of the climate, you do not qualify for refugee status and you will be sent back. And that's happening on the US border currently. There's massive drought in the highlands of Guatemala. And that's the largest number of people, largest group of people currently showing up on the US border are coming from Guatemala. And it's primarily fleeing crop failure and drought. And that doesn't qualify for refugee status. And I've talked to asylum officers who have heard stories of people explaining, you have to understand that there's not enough food, and me and my children will die if we go back. And they will tell these asylum seekers, I believe you. We believe your story, but that does not qualify you for asylum, and you will be deported back to Guatemala now. And so I think we have to think, absolutely, it's like so exigent, so important to think about this now, to think about the limitations of a 50, 60-year-old statute on refugees, a 50-year-old understanding of why people flee their countries. It's outdated, and it's too late for us we cannot keep putting it off, like updating these refugee stats, like updating the definition of refugee, because as Tenzin said, this is the reality of the next century. There's going to be hundreds of millions of people who are going to be forced to leave their countries. And we have to deal with this now. And this isn't just about, of course, the fact that this is what it means to be humane, to be humanitarian, and to protect human rights is to take care of people who are forced to leave their countries. But even outside of that, even among the people who don't believe that in itself is worth dedicating our time to this issue, we have to recognize that this issue will affect everyone. That you see the Syrian refugee crisis, what it did to the political system in Europe. That was about 6 million people fleeing. Can you imagine if it was 10 or 20, like what that does to the geopolitical system? What's happening in Latin American countries as 4 million people flee Venezuela? Like our geopolitical system, our international system is not equipped to deal with this. And it's not just the people fleeing their countries who will suffer if we don't adapt our politics to be able to account for large-scale immigration. It's going to be the entire truly civilizational system that we've built up in the last 200 years.
Would you like to react to each other's statements or add or something like that, please?
Some of your last comments about the international system really not being equipped really resonated with me, and I get hung up on where do we start? Which levers of the system do we try to go and change? What conversations do we need to have? Do we need to fight for the importance of work rights? Do we need to talk about increased what they call burden sharing, which is a horrible title, but the notion behind burden sharing is that, refugee situations are inherently an international problem, and so an international situation, and so funding and support should be going to host governments from other places to support protection and integration of refugees. But you can see the way the international community has framed it. We have a predisposal to picture refugees as a problem. And so when you take a step back, and I increasingly taking a step back and saying, what would it take to change the system itself? And, you know, if you look around at the international refugee response system, it's a lot of people who look and sound like me who are running the show. And we can take a cue from successful movements anywhere in the world and ask who's leading those movements. And right now, refugee response is not in any way at the international level being led by refugees. It's void of refugee voices in most situations. And there's been some movement toward meaningful refugee participation. That's the term the international system is using. And right now, there's a long way to go. It's a lot of refugees sitting on panels, but not participating in the strategizing conversations, not being a part of the decision-making systems. And so when you think about how do we tackle that, what do we do about that, two things come to mind. One is looking inward. So asylum access is a small piece of the refugee response system, but have we lived that value? Are we embracing that? And we have a long way to go. So fighting for meaningful representation on staff, on boards of international response organizations is one small step that we all need to take. But beyond that, supporting refugee-led initiatives is such a huge piece, I think, of changing the system. And there are some really incredible refugee-led initiatives out there that are poised to participate in policy discussions, who are ready to influence strategy design. And one great example of this is a group called the Global Refugee-Led Network, GRN, and they are an 18-person steering committee, mostly of resettled refugees. And that's important to note because in order to participate meaningfully in these advocacy conversations, you have to have protections from a government, and you also have to have permission to travel. And so most of the time that means resettled refugees are participating. But this 18-person steering committee has 6 regional constituencies, and each of those constituencies are connected with refugee-led initiatives all over the world. And they have been fighting for access to UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, decision-making tables for the past 2.5 years, and have been met with a lot of closed doors. And so organizations and institutions that have more power, it's an example of where you can support positioning, support introductions and relationship building, and also step back from the microphone when it's time to step back from the microphone. And maybe I'll pause there. Either one of you want to respond or add?
I think that there's some really key points here that I'd like to highlight. The first is Diana and I were chatting about this, that the process of seeking asylum, getting refugee status, or even knowing that a refugee is different than an asylum seeker, than a migrant, than an immigrant, all of those terminologies and experiences are so difficult for us in the field, and yet we have an understanding, we have degrees. Can you imagine actually living through that experience and not having the education? Can you imagine that? Going to another country and trying to figure out what the process of getting citizenship when you don't speak a word of that language. Trying to understand, putting yourself in that shoes. It's a very, very difficult, set of shoes to put yourself in, but it's one that millions of people have to face every single day. And in terms of leadership versus membership, I talk about this endlessly because I have to talk about it. It is so rare for me to be in a room talking about refugee issues where there are other refugees with me. I am often the only refugee speaking on the panel who has that experience, especially in Silicon Valley, especially with the company I founded, which connects immigrants and refugees to jobs. I'm in San Francisco, where so many people there are building the technology, but don't have the experience to build that technology. And I posed this question to technologists, to engineers, to developers, that how many of you are trying to build the technology, global technologies, and you don't have the global experience? I am not discouraging you from building it. I am just simply saying, partner with someone who has the experience, or enable someone who has the experience. It's important to become members of the community we serve before we try to lead it. And so often in this field of refugee migration space, in international law, I mean, even the documents, we were talking about how the Neanderthal nature of it, that it's so difficult for us to wrap our heads around and mind around the language. When I was working at the UN, that was one of the first jobs I took because I knew that I had to be able to understand how languages in an international setting is processed because I couldn't understand it. And when I worked there, I realized that more and more often than not, international settings, as you mentioned, there is a way of discrediting and the way of isolating the very people it's trying to serve. So how do we make sure that the system changes? I don't think it's the system that will discern and recognize. I think it's the people outside. Never once in the UN did I hear a colleague of mine say, we need to change this. There is an acceptance of the status quo. There's an acceptance of the way that things are done, the way it's done. And it's really when the civil rights activists, it's when the civil society challenges us, when the technologists come up with better innovation that we have no choice but to act upon it. When has government ever taken the responsibility and said, we're gonna change this because we feel it's right? It is the people. And with our company, we say it's simple. With KinStep, we say an advocate. All we needed is an advocate in another company. We partnered with large companies like Airbnb. We partnered with large companies like Chobani and Walmart. And all it took was one person within that company to advocate for us. Just one. One person to say, hey, to their hiring manager, have you looked at this organization? Have you considered hiring a refugee because we need greater diversity? That's all it sometimes takes, is someone speaking out when it's the right time, or not speaking enough and saying, instead of inviting me to the stage, have you considered inviting a migrant? Their English may not be as proficient, but still, to give them an opportunity. The second is storytelling, and it's a really critical piece here that I must emphasize. This country, specifically, I think we're at a time of great sensitivity around this issue. Before I founded my company, I spent 6 months traveling across America to the Midwest, to parts of the South, to understand why it is that Americans hold such strong opinions and perspectives about migrants and about refugees. And I found time and time again, it really was the bilateral conversations that were not happening. So I started a reading group in some of these communities where we just introduced some migrant authors, just to, in small women-led reading groups, or reading groups that were open to having the conversation. And we found that the migrant stories, the people I spoke to said that it's often cast as the worst or the best of people. Migrants in this country are seen as either heroes or villains. And there's not enough nuance. So that is why people have such visceral reactions and emotions and opinions about immigrants, is because the news media and journalism has unfortunately not done us justice to be able to paint complicated pictures of who we really are and our struggle. Because sometimes we're both and sometimes we're neither. So my thing is with our team of first folks that we actually placed in jobs, I started working with them to say, hey, take a camera, providing them with opportunities to storytell. And when migrants tell their own stories that's not told by someone else, they're able to build these very complicated, nuanced pictures of who they are. And there are much more similarities with the natives and native-borns and migrants than there are differences. So we found that through reading groups. And I encourage everyone to start asking, what is one or two changes? Just one or two. It doesn't have to be big ones. It just can be small steps. The third thing I'll talk about is innovation. We're in Silicon Valley here, and this is the hub of innovation. But yet so many technologists and people who are innovating I meet are not working on this large issue of climate crisis and refugee and migrant issues. Why is that? Why are we not talking about the ethics and framework around funding funding refugees who are working on this issue. The number one reasons why my colleagues who are refugees don't work on this issue is because they don't have funding. They don't have the money to not work 2 jobs to then do a startup. It's a privilege to do that. What are the circumstances and environment that we can enable so there can be greater solutions and innovation around this issue? Chatterbox is an example. If you all look up Chatterbox, it's a company that was founded by migrants. And they found that they could crowdsource funding from their other colleagues and people within their network. And they built a platform. All it does is it translates professional translation for people to be able to access the professional world and to be able to understand how to build resumes and such. That came from a migrant. And the only reason that they were able to found that company is because they had the philanthropy to back them up, they had the resources to do that, and they had the social capital. So how can we build greater economic and social capital for immigrants and refugees to tell their own stories, to build companies that can help serve us? As you said, the system has to be changed, but it can't be changed when we're not enabling the very people who are impacted the most by it. How do we make sure they have a voice in this and they have a seat at the table?
I'm sure it'll surprise no one that that problem of who's sitting at the table is absolutely translates into the journalism world in terms of like there's a split between the people who do the writing and the people who get written about. And in the issues I cover most frequently, which is migration, forced migration from Central America, there is such a serious paucity of people, refugees, into Central Americans who are covering these issues, and that's I think a phenomenal failure of the media in this country and internationally. And it's difficult to see like what sort of changes happen quickly. I think from a consumer perspective, somebody reading the news, like if you make sure that you validate and subscribe to and pay money for like newspapers and magazines who are dedicating time, dedicating column space to the voices of people actually affected. And then from a journalist perspective, often, it's, as a freelance journalist, it's hard to turn down assignments sometimes, but often when I'll get pitch something, I make sure I know in my network people who actually have that lived experience who might be much more equipped to write about it than I am, and say that, I thank you for reaching out, but please look at these names. Like, and I think that's something we can all do in our respective fields. I think having these perspectives isn't just useful when we're talking about specifically refugee issues, immigration issues, like wherever our workplaces or wherever our vocational spaces are, trying to understand the sort of voices that are coming at the table, the decision makers, like who's getting to speak on these issues, that we can make room for that, I think, wherever we are. Something else I see in this conversation, this idea of thinking about refugees or immigrants generally as a burden, is the origin of a zero-sum mindset that we have when it comes to immigration. There have been study after study that show that when you resettle a refugee population, the local economy within 20 years has dramatically improved. And you see that in country after country, in context after context. But this conversation that we have in the media or in other spaces about how to deal with this is, how do we deal with this problem? How do we have this, deal with this burden? And there's this idea that people who are immigrating from developing countries or who are immigrating with lower incomes are necessarily going to become a burden, or the, I guess, polite phrase used in the news today is public charge. And I think that is one of the things that we as anybody with a voice, but especially journalists, have both the opportunity and obligation to correct, which is that this is not a zero-sum issue, that immigration is not, and resettlement of refugees is not a net negative on the countries where people are being resettled, and often it's a net positive. And I think that's one of the first steps we need to take, which is framing, this is not as, that's what the problem in terms like burden sharing is, that this is often not as seriously or as huge a problem as it's portrayed. And of course that's one of the main issues when you're talking about immigration in a country like this or internationally, that this idea that, we can't handle that. Like, we can't handle to resettle more than 18,000 refugees. We can't handle taking on large amounts of immigrants. In the United States, until the early 1900s, there was essentially an open borders policy. You showed up at Ellis Island or Angel Island, you did not have to have a visa. You didn't have to, you definitely did go through a door to get here. But that's when people say that, I'm German, my ancestors immigrated legally. Like, yeah, it's because it was anyone could come. Our doors were wide open. You just showed up, you got your stamp in your book, and you were an immigrant here. Germany in 2014 resettled 1 million refugees. And as you've seen a few years later, Germany has not collapsed yet. This is possible. The United States in the late 1970s was integrating huge amounts of Southeast Asian refugees, Vietnamese, like in Texas, and along the Gulf Coast especially, those communities today are thriving. And so I think that this is definitely, when we look at forward thinking about large-scale immigration in the future, it is a problem we have to adapt to, but it's important to remember that that problem is the systems as they exist now, like the obsolescence and backwardness of geopolitical immigration systems and international immigration systems. It's not the immigrants themselves that the problem or the people moving the problem. In many ways, those populations present an enormous opportunity, especially for the countries where they resettle.
In view of the time, we are almost 11. Well, thank you very much. All of you have very well articulated the issues, the problems, right from national government to policies, and particularly you're concerned about the lack of probably international community response like that. I think you have done a pretty good job like that. We know that there are about 70 million displaced people actually around the world actually, and it's not a small number. And whereas United States used to be quite a welcoming country, and now our president has limiting. I understand that he is allowing only 18,000 or something like that. That's a terrible figure actually the way I look at it like that. You have identified a number of barriers actually, number of handicaps or roadblocks actually like that over there. I would really like to see that if the members of the audience have any specific issues that you would like to ask or question or contribute what our scholars here have identified. And also would like to acknowledge the president of our ambassador, Consul General Panda actually is here. Thank you very much for being with us actually over there like that. So I would like to, if you would like to have this one, yes, here is a hand, then 1, 2, yeah, oh, so sweet of you are there.
I'm
yeah.
here for you.
Yeah, thank you very much like that over there. Yes. My only little request is ask a question which is very specific. Shorter the question, the better. If you do feel the need of making a big speech, please go ahead, but I would request limit it actually to your question in a 1 or 2 sentences. Thank you.
With each of those comments, my question got shorter. My name is Ted Johnson, and I teach at Brandeis in the program on conflict and coexistence.
Would you stand so that you let people know that who you are? Yeah, I would like people to be aware of it. Wonderful, thank you, Theodore.
So thank you for your wonderful presentation. I certainly see you have a handle on just a whole array of problems. And I was thinking, as I was listening to you, that I'm wondering if you have begun to look at this in the context of the different pockets that we have to have these conversations, and one of which could be in this sphere of law, in the sphere of politics, and in the sphere of morals. And each one of them has a sort of a different tag on that, and whether or not there has been a conversation within your groups and the folks that you talk about, can we possibly look at this through a tripartite lens? Because people don't want to talk about it because it's not politically to their advantage, or they don't want to talk about it because of moral or other reasons. And just wanted to frame that as a possibility of expanding the conversation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Does anybody want to? Yeah.
Actually, in New York a couple months ago, I was having a conversation similar to the one we were having about the limitations of the definition of refugee with the former UN ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Haiti, and who's now was a big figure in the UNHCR for a period of time, the UN division that deals with refugees. And I was kind of opining a little bit, like, oh, these limitations with the Refugee Convention. There's the, like we should update the definition or change the laws. And he, he's kind of looking at me quietly. And then finally, when I get done, he's like, it's what we have. Like we don't like there aren't. It's not like there's a huge amount of human rights protections that exist out there. That, and he's like, we're not really in the position where we feel like we can move forward and update these laws. We feel like we have been beaten, like surrendered and beaten back and back and back to the absolute last bastions of a defense of human rights that exist. And I see so much work being done internationally in this country that is done within the law. Both the impact litigation that organizations like the ACLU and SPLC are filing against the administration to try and limit the crackdown on asylum access. In the individual cases along the border, it makes, like we've talked about, it makes such a difference to have access to a lawyer. I do think that the legal system is one of the defenses that we have right now. But I think, like you said, that there's a limited amount of work that can be done within the existing legal system. So what's it look like to think outside of that, and to think about it as a political issue or as a moral, a social issue? I think that's one of the main reasons I'm glad I'm a journalist, is because I just have to write about these problems, not solve them. But I do think one of the perspectives is, and this is, I think, being very forward-looking, or maybe taking it a bit too abstract, but I think we have to think about the problem of nationality and the problem of when we associate and directly connect what the status of your human rights are to your national rights. That I was born in San Francisco, and so the quality of my life and the protections I have as a U.S. citizen are fundamentally different than if I had been born in Tegucigalpa, or if I'd been born in Huehue in Guatemala. And I think that we need to think about that as an outdated system, as a system definitely in need of scrutiny. That's how we collate worth as human beings, is attached to citizenship. And I do wonder if, in generations from now, if we'll think about nationality, or like the way that we treated citizenship in today's age, the same way that we're beginning to recognize the constructed nature and the farce and danger of a system of race that we've created, that constructs to devalue and divide human people.
Thank you. Thank you for your question, too. I wanted to, one of the comments you made at the outset about this was identifying that people are being oppressed. And I think that that's a really important starting point, if you see it that way and I see it that way. And then thinking about your 3 pillars and applying them to a system of oppression, right? The law can take you so far, but at the end of the day, most of this is politically motivated. Most of what's happening is politically motivated. In the case of our current administration in the United States, obviously the set of very illogical policies being applied are politically motivated. In the case of the global refugee response system, the emphasis on humanitarian aid is self-serving, because those systems have been constructed by the people who are running them and are still in power. So how do you overcome those political barriers? And I think morality is an important piece of the puzzle to get more allies in support of the movement. Those who can be appealed to will be appealed to and should join the fight. And it's about how you join the fight. And I think your comments were so helpful to illustrate how you join the fight. You don't do it in isolation. You find the refugee-led initiatives and advocates and participate in the way that they're advising that we participate. And then the rest of it for me is about how do you tackle the political question with all of your allies? How do you tackle the political question? And there's a wave of what's called localized response. The idea that we need to look at places where refugees exist and make sure that the money is flowing to the institutions that are responding at a very local level. Right now, the money flows through multiple levels, and with more and more restrictions applied the further they go down, So we've got the UN who's giving it to maybe governments, and maybe some governments are granting to organizations, and maybe some organizations are granting to refugee-led initiatives, and along the way, none of it is core funding. So there's huge gaps. Yeah, very little is left for those who are actually responding to people on a day-to-day basis. And so thinking about money flows and the political disruption is a huge piece of what we need to think about and focus on and fight for, so that the institutions that are doing the response get the money they need. And that includes, in my mind, local governments. Many of, all governments are not one, they're not one person. And, I think a really good example of where you can see that the governments are not one person is Mexico. In Mexico, the United States just pressured Mexico to send 6,000 National Guard troops south to detain and deport en masse. And Mexico already has a really long history of detaining and deporting. Since 2015, they've deported over 500,000 people. But in 2015, 3,000 people got refugee status in Mexico, and this year, 50,000 people will get refugee status in Mexico. And so the Refugees Department in Mexico is run by human rights activists, and they agree with the path that we're talking about here today. And knowing that some entities, if we took all that money instead of asking 6,000 troops to go south and strengthened Mexico's asylum system, we would be in a much different space than we are today. So I think just the money flows question is a really interesting way to think about the politics.
Yeah, I just want to comment on that. I think it's the trifecta in this case, while it's essential, like the legal, political, as well as moral. The three are critical, but I think that the reason why I find that this issue is not always approached by all three angles is because of scarcity. Scarcity, yes. So oftentimes we know who the other players are, so we know that there's organizations working on the political bend of it, and then organizations on the ground, and organizations who are front lines advocating. But there is not always a multilateral approach towards this issue, because there's scarcity in fighting for the resources. There's scarcity in also prioritizing. Do we do integration? Do we do the legal piece? Do we tackle the impunity? So that's, I think, the practical reason for the barrier of why the trifecta has not been as clear and as defined in this space, from my experience. When I was at when I worked in Thailand, the issue that kept coming up was the Rohingya crisis, in the Burmese border, and many of those settings, there were political organizations that wouldn't even have and broach the conversation, because it was thought, oh, well, this is a political issue, not a refugee crisis. This is an internal state matter, not an international crisis. So how do you meaningfully approach these conversations when there's not a meaningful understanding? And for me, the underpinning is the morality. That's the one core that will never leave, and that's unchanging. Even Gandhi's teachings today, Dr. King's teachings today, is still relevant. And it's when you go outside of the system, and when you are able to, within one organization or system, build and work with the other trifecta, build with the politics, build with the legality, build with the morality of it, then you can showcase the system that it can work in another setting. But it has to be specific. You have to tackle one of the problems. I don't think it is possible, and I think it would be too exhausting to do all of it at once. There are a few organizations that try, and I think should be commended on the effort, but it's very difficult. This is very exhausting work as well for many of us. To be on the front lines or to be advocating, even those who are not on the front lines, this is emotionally draining work. And it takes a lot of spiritual and moral courage and humility to do this work.
Thank you very much for that. We have a question. Yeah, yourself, that's right.
Hi, my name is Sharon Quinsat, and I'm an assistant professor of sociology in Grinnell College. It's a rural, it's in rural Iowa. It's a liberal arts school. So I'm studying refugees who are resettled in rural America, particularly those coming from Africa. There's a lot in Iowa coming from Mozambique, Somalia, Sudan, Burmese refugees as well. And so my question actually is based on what you started, Tenzin. It was really nice when you said that it's about integrating refugees with dignity. And I think a common theme that came out is about the language when you talk about refugees and also the stories we tell. And so I'm interested because this is one that I've observed as well. And talking about refugees, the ways in which we counter this like hegemonic discourse that we have about refugees as passive and helpless victims just waiting for Western generosity or the humanity of global elites in order for them to get out of this situation. And I think that we somehow validate this in academia or in other institutions like in journalism even. And so I'd like to ask a question about like how do we make sure that we don't do this in our work and that refugees are actually, they become sources of knowledge rather than just objects for us to study, to scrutinize in academia or even in mass media. And so how we portray them in such a way that they tell their own stories in their own terms when there are gatekeepers within these institutions that we are, of course, trying to also like confront. Like in academia, for example, when I write for research grants, it has to connect with the interests of course, elites, like policymakers, politicians within, of course, rural Iowa, if this connects to or validates like certain policy proposals by the Democrats or Republicans or whatever. And so also in countering this hegemonic discourse, I wanna ask, how do we not fall into the trap also of portraying migrants, if we tell their own stories, but still work within this so-called institutional norms that we're confronting? How do we not fall into the trap of like portraying like one as deserving rather than the other who is not deserving? So if we try to share stories about migrants or refugees who are successful in integrating or they have, kind of like achieved the American dream, so to speak, and we're portraying others or we're sort of like making invisible those who have not. And so I just want to like ask these questions because studying refugees is also a way for us to sort of like confront the structures of power that we have in, not just in American society, but the international system as well.
Very good, thank you. Do you have any answer to the long question?
So I think that, as you stated, it's not a monolith. That the very belief system that refugee stories can be told in multiple parts, in multiple forms, is something that should be agreed upon. Refugee experience is not a monolith. There are some refugees who come with a lot of social capital and economic capital that even though they're involuntary migrants, they're still able to flee with capital. There's other refugees who are not even recognized, for their full humanity. So I would say, in my opinion, as academics, it's the saying of treat these individuals not as objects, but as subjects. And the best academics, in my opinion, and the best academics who are studying this issue are the ones who go and spend time, learn the language of one refugee community. I don't think it is possible for an academic to understand all of the plethora of issues of all the refugee communities. If it is, please let me know who they are, because I'd love to meet them. But understanding one refugee community and then telling that story through their lens is often a more powerful way. So I'll give you an example. How many of you here have understood or heard of trauma gene, the trauma gene in epigenetics? So 2 people. So when I was in the Himalayas, a lot of researchers from the University of Wisconsin-Madison were coming to our community to understand one type of gene that was different among Tibetan refugees, and that was what they call the trauma gene. So that is a gene that has been passed down sometimes up to 7 generations within a family, and it lives within the biology of the individuals. It's within our makeup. And this gene can elicit many things and can showcase many things. So one example is our physical biology. So there are multiple diseases like stomach issues, like stomach cancer, for example, that's been linked to people who have this type of gene. The other is mental health and depression. When this gene is triggered, depression is seen as doubling in this community. Holocaust survivors have this, and a lot of people who fled countries and seen mass atrocities, so trauma, people, victims and survivors of trauma have this specific gene, and it can be passed down up to 7 generations until it's no longer visible. So they came to our community to understand and actually take samples of our blood and all of that. And I remember one of the professor who was leading that study, I remember the thing which really amazed me was that he tried his best with the research team to first and foremost integrate, to understand, to live amongst us, to not right away judge. There's so much judgment in academia. There's so much philosophy of judgment of this is the way it is. These are the subjects, but they gave us immense freedom to talk about why would we have the trauma gene? How does it manifest in our everyday lives? So I think that was an example, in my opinion, of dealing with a very sensitive topic in academia with great care and responsibility, something that journalists and academics sometimes forgo and are absent of. In journalism, I would say it's enabling stories from refugee entrepreneurs and refugee journalists. I know many refugee journalists who've never been published on BBC or The Guardian. They would love to be. They're incredibly good writers, but as you said, sometimes telling the editor, maybe it's not me, maybe it's them, giving that voice, giving that platform. So those are the 2 examples I can think of.
Hi, sorry, I was really very impressive. I must compliment the panelists. I'm Sanjay Panda, Consul General of India in San Francisco. I have a very small pointed question for all of you. I've been very engaging conversation. I'm quite enjoying that. You see, from the perspective of a developing country, you mentioned about Rohingyas. This is one is in a catch-22 sort of a situation. Especially from a developing country perspective, when you have scarce resources and then your internal political dynamics are there. How do you reconcile that with the 3 pillars that you mentioned? How do you reconcile that? I mean, you look at it, get into the shoes of the politicians and others in developing countries and the resource constraint.
This is a very hard question, right? And so I'm going to offer some thoughts. But to me, this is why it's so important that response is localized. The response needs to not happen in clouds in Geneva, New York. Response needs to happen at a very local level where you are engaging the government, civil society, refugee-led groups, and to the extent there are international donors who are coming to the table, international donors as well. And I think your point is really well made. If you're seeing in the news in Ecuador in the past 2 weeks, the government lifted an oil subsidy, and it has caused major strife and unrest in Ecuador, lots of rioting. And part of that dialogue is, wait a second, but the Venezuelan refugees are getting so much support. How come our indigenous communities, how come our poor communities aren't receiving the same kind of support? So we can't, when we're talking about solutions, ignore that countries have real problems, real challenges that are also present when we propose solutions. So it can't be in a vacuum. And to harken back to Sharon's comment, part of that solution finding means engaging local academia in the pursuit of solutions, local policymakers in the pursuit of solutions. I heard a statistic recently from a Canadian academic who's been researching localized response, and he was saying that 80% of the funding for research on refugees is provided in the global north. Whereas obviously the Global South is hosting the majority of the world's refugees. And so it's just one more imbalance that makes it really hard to come up with solutions. And I think we can villainize host governments for not making the wrong choices, but unless we examine the way the whole system is supporting, is acknowledging the reality of host government situations, we're also very unlikely to come up with long-term solutions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anybody else would like to have a question? Yes, okay, and thank you. Yes, please.
I'm just curious about, you mentioned it's hard for the refugees to organize themselves. And is that, I'm wondering how many of the refugees in general have connectivity, like a mobile phone, that sort of thing? And it seems to me, as an outsider, and I'm not an expert in this area at all, you know, they don't have much financial capital, they don't have political capital. But is there a way for them to be, you know, conceptually other folks in the community they're trying to enter, the country they're trying to adopt them, so to create a human connection in a way that would enable the population they're trying to get into to better understand the condition, but more on a one-on-one basis rather than this generic, you know, the Ecuadorians are having an issue and they're coming to our borders. Is there a way to connect people more directly with the refugees?
Yeah, I don't know the exact figure of how many refugees are connected and with technology, but I do know that it's quite high. The connectivity is not an issue. What I was talking about was self-organizing around resources to be able to build organizations and to be able to structure and sustain organizations. So for example, in Syria, during the crisis and mass migration of the Syrians, that many entrepreneurs from Syria were the ones who were actually building the platform to be able to link with their family members and to be able to send money back home through blockchain technology. But it's just that most of those organizations now are no longer in existence. There was a cycle of 2 to 3 years, and the reason is because they don't have funding. The proper mechanisms don't exist. It's not the lack of connectivity, it's the lack of structures to be able to sustain the connectivity in a larger system.
Thank you. Yes, you have a question.
Hi, my name is Amelie. I'm a student in international policy here. I've been studying this issue for a really long time, and I think from a lot of both visits to refugee camps and seeing sort of how technology and biopolitics play out there, but also from doing a lot of research with the immigration policy lab here on ICE using like algorithms to evaluate whether to deport someone on the spot. Now this algorithm, quote unquote, always says to deport. I guess my broader question is the role of technology, opportunities for refugees, and also pitfalls and potential for like really oppressive structures through, like masked through the veil of, oh, this is an algorithm, right? This is not a human biased response, but obviously these algorithms are gonna have bias from humans built into them. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but I think there's a lot of new challenges through that.
Yeah, there's an unfortunately dystopian news plug. I've been reporting this last week. There's the Department of Homeland Security has now announced that they will begin mass DNA testing immigrant detainees, both in Customs and Border Patrol detention and ICE detention. And that's not just a big deal in the immigration context. That is, this is going to be the first time that the United States government is going to mass DNA test people who have not even been accused of crimes. Immigration, crossing the border without papers or living in this country undocumented are both civil violations. They're not criminal violations. So this is the first time ever that the government's mass DNA testing people who haven't been even not arrested for a crime, not charged with a crime, not convicted of a crime. So it's an enormous expansion of government power and government technology, because now these kits and these abilities to rapidly DNA test people are going to be widely available. And I do think that this is a pretty serious issue, and one that really deserves our attention and scrutiny and quite potentially our resistance. I talked to a few historians, ethnic studies professors who have studied the history of US immigration. Just 100 years ago, we had a pretty dedicated eugenics understanding in our immigration systems. At the origin, the 1907 Immigration Act of 1907, that was the origin of that term public charge, also named an ineligible alien class to include feeble-minded people, insane persons, all sorts of ableist terms. And there'd be surgeons at the ports actually examining people for quote-unquote mental and physical defects. And these people who have studied this history are understandably worried that now the government is going to begin taking mass DNA tests. These are mostly looking, right now the DNA tests are looking for non-coding portions of DNA, which are useful as like a genetic fingerprint and not, they won't really tell you a lot about inheritable traits. But the fact that they're building the technology to collect that DNA in the first place, you know, it's not, like ICE is developing algorithms right now to search people's Facebook profiles or publicly available information and make a judgment of whether or not this person will become, and this is quote, productive member of society or go on to commit criminal or terrorist acts. And the fact that there's an algorithm like that's being built to scan Facebook profiles, it's not difficult to imagine that, you know, we're moving towards a world where somebody's DNA, their genetic code is going to be scanned the same way as a Facebook profile, looking for red flags or quote unquote defects. And I mean, junk science, scientific racism has been used to limit immigration in the past, and I think that we have to be really concerned that this is a potential future we're heading towards.
Can I really quickly follow up as well? What is the role of tech companies, right? So it's not just WhatsApp, it's not just Facebook, right? But a lot of asylum seekers communicate through WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, but not obviously understood, right? So I would love to hear your thoughts on the company's responsibility to provide or encrypt data in a way that is not accessible to governments, and I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
So I think that this is something that many of us are frightened by. So I'll take the example of China. There is recent Guardian piece that said that in China it takes 7 to 10 seconds to be able for the cameras that are state-of-the-art cameras all around the streets, 7 to 10 seconds to identify a person. And many times the Chinese military in this piece was said that they were finding and identifying the Uyghur minorities or the Tibetan minorities who were seen to be of conflict within 7 to 10 seconds just based on their movements, just based on the facial recognition algorithm. So it's frightening to us that the very technology that we thought would enable and give us some level of freedom is now censoring and isolating and violating our privacy. So China is one of the few examples where technology companies have actually not stepped up. Many of them have kowtowed to the policies of China and said, we're willing to gain money, gain our first incentive, which is financial capital in a billion-plus market. And I say to them that you have actually greater exercise and greater power. When Google, for example, in the early 2000s decided that it was going to extricate itself from China, there were consequences. And the consequences that they were standing up to a government. And if tech companies understood that they have a lot of power here that they're giving away, to be able to coalesce, to work, to unite, to be able to stand up against corrupt governments of any kind that are using and abusing their technology. I think there is a responsibility. It's a grave responsibility that technology companies have to ensuring that they do not exploit the data of the people that they're trying to sell. And I was saying this to someone earlier that there are only 2 industries that I know that call individuals that are their audience users: drugs and technology. So we need to change that. We are not users. We are not bystanders who are users. Maybe perhaps it can start with the way we identify the individuals.
Anybody else has a question? Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Nalani Hall through the Institute of Community Leadership. Thank you for being here. So I heard you talking about earlier how many of the policies from before have changed since then, and as well as many climate refugees now have been turned away because of these policies. But also you've talked about how still back then there was a lot of flaws in how the policies were made and what they were. Why do you think now there is such a push to change these policies, even with those flaws back then? Thank you.
I think looking at the history of like what the flaws in the process. I think it gets back to what we were talking about, was who was actually at the table, who got to make those decisions. And during the original refugee conventions, it was absolutely Europeans, it was absolutely Westerners, and absolutely men who were at the table figuring out what qualifies for refugee status. And so I think that that's looking at that history is a great way of looking at how we need to go forward, which is who's going to be developing these policies, these frameworks, these conventions, who's going to actually be sitting at the table. And I think that, from this conversation, it's clear that it should be people who actually experienced refugeeism themselves, and people from the global south, people from a great diversity of communities actually like looking forward and developing these policies. Something else I just, when we're looking forward to changing the laws or adapting to climate refugeeism, it can feel a little bit disempowering sometimes to look at how monumental these structures are that we need to change to go forward. And so in the spirit of civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance, I think it's worth bringing up the history, the one I know specifically about a individual civic response that you can take to immigration is the sanctuary movement that began in the late 1970s and 1980s in this country. There was enormous, some of the worst violence in the Americas happened in the 1970s and 80s in El Salvador and Guatemala. It's been legally recognized as genocide against indigenous people in both countries. There was a huge mass movement out of Central America to the United States where Ronald Reagan invented the term economic migrants to describe the people fleeing massacres in Central America. And less than 1% of them went on to gain refugee status, even though they were fleeing some of the most brutal civil wars of the 20th century. What was the response? The response was that churches would welcome Salvadoran refugees into their thresholds and would bar the doors. People would put their bodies between refugees and INS coming to grab them. American citizens using their privilege, using their capacities to protect people from being taken back. And it was very simple. It's like, you're not sending these people back to a place where they're going to be killed. And so that is a precedent, and that is the origin of the sanctuary city movement, sanctuary state movement that exists today. And I think it's, I'm a journalist, not an activist or advocate, but I do think that that's a history that's worth looking at if we want to understand like what could potentially happen in the future as our legal and political protections of refugees continue to diminish, and as the intensity and the horror of what people are fleeing across the world continues to increase.
Can I add one small thing? I just wanted to add that the historic perspective is helpful because we see that the work is just never done, right? So when you think you're making progress, then we backslide, and then we think we're making progress and we backslide, and it's why I think it's so important that we look at civil society activism and support it as much as we possibly can, because even in moments that look and sound great, that possibility of a political wind shifting is on the horizon, and there has to be somebody to catch it and help the pendulum swing back toward justice over time.
Wow, thank you. Anybody else has a question? Or I will have the last question. Well, thank you very much, first of all, for your input, your contribution. I have one minor question because something I want to also know about it. Now, there are a number of players in this whole scenario. Individual governments are there, United Nations is there, members of civil society, humanitarian organizations are there. Particularly among the humanitarian organizations, is there enough well-coordinated approach that all these various humanitarian organizations trying to address the issues and the problem, do they sometimes have a kind of a well-coordinated approach so that, hey, here is a region or a country, you go and concentrate there, or we both have to know each other, the right hand knows what the left hand is doing. Is there anything like that that you probably want to comment about it?
I think that there's lots of pockets of great coordination happening all over the world in For example, in Southeast Asia, there's the Asia Pacific Rights Network, APRIN. They're very well coordinated. There's the Working Group for the Brazil Plan of Action in Latin America. They're very well coordinated. These are examples of groups of activists that have really banded together, have a singular voice, and are trying their hardest to work together. Like any other industry, there's only so much money, and I think it's doing a disservice if we don't acknowledge that there's competition for resources happening through the industry in terms of approaches with between organizations, and I think that there is a need to have a real stop and reflection point about the way that resources are being collected and redistributed. A lot of the viewpoints are quite similar, and a lot of people are operating in the same communities, and it's not feeling like it has that localized underpinning, right? It's that there's 5 different major INGOs working in the same community, building wells, so not that those efforts are a problem inherently, they're not, they're deeply important, and money should flow toward these efforts, but I think that you're acknowledging a problem.
We'll start by thanking my fellow panelists. Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation, giving me a lot to think about. Thank you, Dr. Kapoor, and thank you all for being here. I think Susan, right? Sharon, sorry. Back to your point about avoiding the construct of heroes versus villains when it comes to immigration. I think it's important that soldiers, child soldiers deserve human rights, deserve refugee status. People who are recruited into gangs when they're as young as 9 years old in Central America deserve refugee status. People who've committed crimes deserve refugee status. People who will go on to become a quote-unquote public charge deserve refugee status. And that's another way of saying that all these people deserve human rights. Like, whatever the reason for your immigration, you deserve to have the fundamental human rights that we afford to all people. And I think that's an important thing to remember in our reporting and in our talking about this issue, is remembering that you don't have to be a hero, you don't have to go on to become a CEO or Rhodes Scholar to deserve the protections afforded to human beings when you're migrating or living in a refugee context. Last one, another point of that too is it's so easy to continue to talk about this these issues as one of dependency or one of tragedy. And I think it's important to remember that, first off, when we talk about coordination or efforts to address this issue, there's thousands of people in this fight, and there's incredible work being done. I see it every time I go down to the border, the amount of people who are there helping. Is there enough? Certainly not. There's not enough, but these people are in the fight. And I think we have to remember migration is beautiful. The people who take their children and go in search of a better life or a better, different community elsewhere, that's incredible. And it's beautiful, and there's a lot of power and beauty in that. And also in refugees, it's not simply people who are dependent or who are a burden, that there is incredible resilience in the ability to not give up hope, to take your children, to take your family, and in the face of some of the worst adversity imaginable in the human experience, some of the worst things that we can do to each other, not give up on your own life, and not give up on the chance for a faith in humanity, to say, I'm going to leave because somewhere somebody is going to welcome me. And I talk to a lot of lawyers who, of course, especially in they've always been facing so much adversity when it comes to asylum access and refugee laws, but especially in the Trump age. I've asked them, how do you continue going? You're hearing these such horrible stories every day. Secondary trauma is real, vicarious trauma is real when you hear about people's experiences. And they brought up, so many of them brought up a concept that for me is truly beautiful, which is the idea of vicarious resilience, which is that when they meet with their clients, when they meet with refugees who have come often with their children, they see that they have not given up, facing some of the worst adversities imaginable, that they have crossed borders, they've crossed oceans, they've crossed deserts to be here. And when they see that, they know that this fight continues. Like, they haven't given up, so I can't give up on this issue. And I think that that's absolutely what motivates my own work, is that talking to the people I've spoken to who have either fled violence or simply, I remember talking to one man who said that I work 16 hours a day in a cane field, and I've come here with my son because I don't want him to live that way. Not technically a refugee, but I think that I have, it absolutely motivates me to continue doing my work, thinking about the beauty and resilience and power of the people who are immigrating, of the people who are becoming refugees.
I would just say that the panelists here, thank you so much. We've highlighted some of the problems, but I want you to also think about the solutions, that this is an opportunity also to find the solutions to these problems. And if nothing else, just doing one thing. I think behavioral changes is the most difficult task ahead for all of us. And the refugees crisis here does not need big heroes leaping forward. We just need small steps. So come on a step with me. One thing, just one thing within your everyday life that you could do differently, whether it's talking to a migrant or a refugee, maybe it's translation if you speak 2 languages. Maybe it's volunteering at International Rescue Committee. Whatever it is, just commit to one thing for this issue. And I think that that's the opportunity that we would love.
Just to say thank you very much for having me. I think the call to action was a beautiful way to end the conversation.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for being such a wonderful audience. You all know that this is the 150th anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi's birthday. And I have here some bookmarks that you may like to keep. And the first thing that I have always admired, the whole world is my family. If we have that kind of a thinking and attitude, and let us remember that refugees are human beings. Do not forget that. They are there in those difficult situations beyond their control, like that. They are displaced by the circumstances they have no control over there. They are human beings. They are members of our human family. If we can think of them like that, I think we have paid tributes to Gandhi also today. And let us give them a very warm applause to all our teams. If anybody wants to take a picture, we are available.